We're going to continue on in Exodus this morning. We're in Exodus chapter 4. So if you have a Bible, feel free to turn there. My friend Serge is going to come up and he's going to read for us starting at verse 18. So this is going to be Exodus 4, verse 18 through to the end of verse 31. And after that, we will look at this together. Thank you. Come right here so we can make sure we get it. Step right up there. There we go. Thank you.
I think I need to turn this on. Hi, everyone. So here we go. Exodus 4, verse 18. So starting at 18. Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead." So Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart, so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, 'Thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son.'" At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. It was then that she said, "A bridegroom of blood," because of the circumcision. The Lord said to Aaron, "Go into the wilderness to meet Moses." So he went and met him at the mountain of God and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had sent him to speak, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshiped. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. Well done. All right. There are times in our lives when God's intervention looks very different than we thought it would look. If you have had a relationship with Jesus for any length of time, you probably know what I've just said to be very true. There are things often in our lives that we ask God for, ways that we're hoping that he might step in and intervene. And when he does, it's very, very different than what we were expecting. That's the very thing that we see happening here in these verses that we're going to be looking at this morning in Exodus chapter 4. And there have already been some very surprising things in this story already as we've been going through this over the past few weeks. Of course, this story starts with Moses as a baby being placed in a basket and being set out adrift on the Nile River. That's not normal. That's not normal parenting. Okay? Even what happens after that of Moses being retrieved from the waters and then amazingly growing up as a prince in Pharaoh's house. But then the same Moses going and trying to take matters into his own hand. And then there's murder in this story when he when he kills somebody who is hurting, who is beating one of his fellow Hebrew brothers. There are lots of surprises already in this story as we move along, and I've not even made reference yet to the burning bush and God speaking through that and miraculous signs that God gives. But this morning what we're going to be looking at in terms of God's intervention in Moses' life is also going to catch us a bit off guard. There's some surprises in this story as well, and part of that is because we can relate to this. If we have a relationship with Jesus and we love God and we're worshiping God, we're wanting to live for him, we know, many of us in this room, we know that there are times in our lives when God's intervention surprises us It looks very different to what we were expecting. So in Exodus 4:24, the big surprise in these verses that we're looking at here is Exodus 4:24, where we read, "At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him," that's Moses, "and sought to put him to death." Like, what? This really should catch us off guard, because everything else in this story so far doesn't seem to be building to this point. It seems to be building to something else, surely, something grand, something wonderful in this amazing story of the Exodus. But then chapter 4, verse 24, what is going on here? God meets with Moses and seeks to put him to death. Why? Why is this in the story? Isn't Moses God's chosen individual to go and to liberate God's people who are in slavery in Egypt? Hasn't God just in the chapter, starting in the chapter before, in the first part of chapter 4 itself, just spoken to Moses, saying, here's what I'm calling you to do. Here's who you're going to go and speak to. Here's what you are going to say. What is going on with verse 24? What is going on with verse 24? Clearly, some of us think, well, there are clearly some days where God is just in a bad mood, and this surely must be one of those days. God, it seems as though, has had this complete change of heart. Moses, this impressive person that we've been reading about, that we've been studying over the past few weeks, now God's seeking to put him to death. What is going on here? Well, before we get into that in detail, let me tell you that these verses that we're looking at this morning, these verses are a big part of why we're doing this series in the first place. And the reason for that is twofold. Firstly, I had never really noticed these verses. I mean, I'm 41 now. I'm much older than most of you, and I had never really noticed these verses. I'd grown up in a Christian family. I grew up as a youth group kid, all of that stuff. And for some reason, I had just blasted through these anytime I was going through this story. I hadn't noticed it before. But the second thing is, once I had slowed down, and for me, the way this came about is my wife Natalia and I had been reading months ago a book written by a friend of ours in the UK named Terry Virgo. The book I've told you about before in this series is called God's Treasured Possession. And it's a look in detail at the story of the Exodus and the life of Moses. But in that book, Terry goes into detail about what's happening here. And as I was reading it, I feel like to some degree I can relate to this. I felt like I saw myself in this a little bit. I'm not saying I'm Moses. That's not the point at all. But there were parts of this, of what God's doing in Moses' life in confronting him, that I felt like I could relate to. I felt like what Natalia and I had walked in the previous months and the previous years. I felt like there was a type of death that I had experienced myself. Now, I know that sounds melodramatic, okay? I know it does. I don't mean for it to. This is church. This is not. This is us. I don't mean to be melodramatic up here. I'm being honest with you. I felt like I could relate to it. I don't know about you, maybe you, like me, maybe not, but maybe as you've read the story of Exodus before, if you have, maybe you've gone right over these verses as well and just haven't stopped to think like me, like, oh my goodness, what is going on here? It's important that we slow down. It's important that we look at this together. So needless to say, when I got to these verses, it had my attention. I was like, my goodness. And I felt through that there was part of this that God wanted to bring to us as a church. As I said, these verses that we're looking at this morning, not the only reason, but they're a big part of why we're doing this series that you're going to be in for the next 15 years of your life, okay? So it's a big part of why we're doing this series in the first place. So what is happening here? What's happening here? Let's set the scene a little bit. Moses goes to Jethro. That's his father-in-law at the beginning of these verses that we're looking at, starting at verse 18. And he says, let me go to Egypt to see if my brothers are still alive. The reason he goes to Jethro, his father-in-law, is in part because he's working for his father-in-law. He's a shepherd. He does that to honor his father-in-law. His father-in-law responds saying, go in peace. So Moses takes his wife, Zipporah, and their sons, and they start making their way to Egypt. We read that Moses places his wife and the sons onto a donkey. It's interesting, isn't it? We see something of a biblical or a Christmas picture here, don't we? Moses walking alongside. We read that his wife and sons, that they are on the donkey, and we read that Moses has the rod of God in his hand. That's an interesting detail to add, but that detail is in there because of what we had looked at last week, where this same rod of God, Moses is told by God to throw it on the ground, and it turns into a serpent. He's told to grab it by the tail, and it turns back into a rod, back into a staff. The writer here is contrasting what Moses' family, what they're being carried by, which is a donkey, and what Moses' strength is in, what Moses is being carried by, and that is the staff of God. There's a contrast that's being presented here before us. And off they go. God has given Moses a message to bring to Pharaoh, but God says to Moses, and I'm only going to be able this morning to touch on this quickly, but God says to Moses that he has hardened Pharaoh's heart. He's hardened Pharaoh's heart. That's something that God says that troubles many people. There are some that take that and interpret it to mean that Pharaoh is simply a pawn in this story, that he has no say in the matter, and that God is just out for Pharaoh's destruction and is actually unfair. I want you to know that's not what is happening here. When we read this, when we read that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and we're going to read that again as we keep going in future weeks, what is actually happening here is God is quickening what has already been happening in Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh already has this attitude towards God's people. He already has it out for them. It is not God planting hatred into Pharaoh's heart. That hatred is already there. God is quickening it for his purposes. And in this case, his purposes are for the liberation of his people. So God says to Moses, you're going to go to Pharaoh. This is the message that you and your brother Aaron are to bring to them. We don't need to read this as thinking that Pharaoh simply has no say in the matter, because that is not true. In fact, Scripture says later on, and we'll come on to this in Exodus chapter 8, twice in Exodus chapter 8, in fact, and in Exodus chapter 9, that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Okay, so don't think that Pharaoh is an innocent player in all of this. So there they are. That's the background. They're on this journey towards Egypt. And it's then that we read in verse 24 that the Lord sought to put Moses to death. Now, we don't know exactly what that looks like, other than Moses, for some reason, becomes incapacitated. It would seem as though he has some sort of debilitating illness or ailment that renders him just unable to do anything. Unable to speak, unable to do anything to try to intervene, because he is silent through what is happening here for the next few verses himself. It's likely that he's been struck down by some sort of debilitating ailment, and we read that his wife, Zipporah, does what I suspect and hope none of the wives in this room would do when their husbands say they're not feeling well. She takes a flint stone, which is going to be sharp on the edge, and immediately she circumcises their son. Some of you husbands are inching away from your wives right now, knowing that you are never going to be complaining about feeling unwell ever again. I mean, this is a weird story. She circumcises their son, and then she says something very, very strange. She says, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." She takes what she cuts off of her son, and she touches Moses' feet with it. She says, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." What in the world is happening here? Why is this story in here? What is going on? Well, as you would expect, there's a lot that's going on. And believe it or not, there's a lot that's going on that is extremely relevant for us, including here today and life in Ottawa today. I'm going to give it this heading. What is happening is that God is actually showing kindness to Moses. God is actually showing kindness to Moses. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, this does not look like kindness. How in the world could something being cut off of Moses' son and being touched to Moses' feet while God is seeking to put Moses to death, how in the world does that look like kindness? Death, blood. How does that look like kindness? To which I say to you that the gospel says that there's one who was actually put to death as the ultimate expression of God's kindness to us. We need to be open to God's kindness, in fact, all of God's ways looking very, very different to what we might expect. That's certainly what is happening here in these verses. If you're wondering why I'm standing up here and telling you that what's happening is actually God is showing kindness to Moses, if you're wondering why that is, well, we need to understand some of the backstory in what has even gotten Moses and his wife to this point. There's a lot that we don't know about what's happening here, as in the specific sickness or what's exactly happening in Moses that brings him to the point of death, other than the Lord sought to do it. We read that. But what we do know is that one of Moses' sons has not been circumcised. And we do know from Genesis chapter 17 that part of God's covenant with Abraham is that all of the Hebrew people, all of God's chosen people at that time, all of the males were to be circumcised as a sign of that covenant. That was a command that was given in Genesis chapter 17. Moses would have known that. Moses can't take the excuse of, oh, well, I wasn't aware. He would have known that. But for some reason, his son was not circumcised. So we have to ask the question, well, why? Why would that be the case? This is Moses. Like, this is the one that God has chosen with this great calling to be used by God to liberate God's people. It's like, he knows better. Why in the world would Moses not have circumcised his son? Now again, to be clear, the text isn't exactly clear on the reason why, but most commentators are agreed that it is most likely because his wife, Zipporah, was not Hebrew herself, and it is thought that she was disgusted by the act of circumcision, even offended by it. So the thinking is that when they had it's thought that this was probably Moses' second son who was not circumcised. It could be that when their first son was circumcised, that she was disgusted by that, even a witness to it, and was like, no, not again. And then when they had their second son, that there was a conflict in the marriage, and that Moses backed off to try to keep the peace. That's the thinking about what is happening here. We don't know exactly. What we do know is that their son is not circumcised. And the reason why commentators believe that it was because of a conflict in the marriage and her being grossed out by it, the answer is kind of obvious, isn't it? It's because of what she does. Like, otherwise, that's just a weird thing to do, right? Why not grab a Tylenol? No, I'm going to circumcise my son. That's going to sort this thing out. She knows that there's something about doing that. There's something about doing that matters, that is important. It'd be hard to think of any other explanation for her actions. So she does that, and God relents, and Moses lives. There's something of the Garden of Eden, and I've said this before in this series. You're going to hear it again. There's something of the Garden of Eden being played out here. Remember the garden. Remember God saying to Adam and Eve, I want you to enjoy all of this. There's one command, though, that I'm giving to you. You are not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We picture it today as stories go down about it being an apple tree. We don't actually know if it's an apple tree. We know there's a tree, the knowledge of good and evil. They are not to eat of the fruit of that tree. But what happens? The serpent shows up, the serpent that we heard about again last week. The serpent shows up, deceives Eve. But Adam knew the truth. Like when Eve speaks to Adam, it's like, oh, hey, we should do this. We should do this. Adam should have stood firm. Like, women get the blame in a lot of it was all Eve. It wasn't all Eve. Adam should have stood firm and said, no, that's not right. This is not what God has said. And so we see it playing out again here in Exodus chapter 4. Moses as well. Even if his wife, not perhaps understanding this as a mark of the covenant, not understanding the importance of circumcision, that God had commanded this for Hebrew males, Moses should have stood firm. He should have stood firm, and he said, no, this is what the Lord has commanded us. We need to do this. But Moses doesn't. We see something of the garden playing out again. Guys in the room, we need a better example of godly men, don't we? We need a better example of a truly godly man. We need a better example of husbands. The point of going through this series with you is not to show you Moses and go, let's all be amazed at what a hero of the faith he is. That's not the point. Because already in this series, we've been introduced to Moses, who's a murderer. We've been introduced to Moses, who would dare to look at God when God says, I'm going to send you to go to speak to the elders of Israel, and they're going to believe you. And Moses would dare to look at God and go, they're not going to believe me. Like, my goodness. And now we're learning about Moses, who's the covenant breaker. We're learning about Moses, who's the covenant breaker, who didn't circumcise his own son. So we need a better hero. We need a better husband. We need a better example of what it means to be a fully, truly godly man. It's not Moses, not in this story. We need one who is better. Praise God that he has provided one who is better, one who is greater. So what's happening here? God is confronting Moses. This is God's way of saying to Moses, no further. We have to deal with this. And you know what that is? That's grace. That's what that is. That's kindness. Let me speak to the couples in the room just for a moment. And this isn't exclusive to couples in the room, but within the context of what we're looking at here in Exodus chapter 4, is there something that you know God has been in the process of confronting in your life that you need to get out into the open? Is there something that you know you need to say to your spouse? Something where you've relented perhaps, something where you've given ground, where you've backed off, where you know that in doing that that's been wrong and that you need to hold firm to what God has said. Consider that. Please consider that, because this is serious stuff. This is serious stuff. Don't miss out on the grace that God has for you in this, the kindness that he has for you at times in our lives, saying, no further. No further. We have to deal with this. I want us to look at 3 reasons why this is not cruel that God is doing this, but that this is actually kindness. Number 1, God is making it clear that he takes his word, including his promises, seriously. Imagine Moses continuing on in this journey. Imagine if what happens here, verse 24, imagine if that hadn't happened. And imagine if Moses just continues on in this journey, knowing that he has this huge area of his life that God has said, this is to be a mark of the covenant. This is what it's to look like, that your sons are to be circumcised, and him choosing disobedience. Imagine Moses continuing on and going to Pharaoh, knowing that he had been disobedient to what God said. You'd understand if Moses at times had thoughts of, I don't know how seriously God takes his own word. I don't know how serious he is about what he says. You know what the next thought would be? I don't know how serious he's going to be about what he said to me. I don't know how serious he's going to be about what he said to me about going in front of Pharaoh and me leading his people into freedom. If he's not serious about what he said to Abraham then, if he was just making that up, or if that was a lie, if he can't be trusted with that, maybe he's not going to be able to be trusted with what he said to me. Let me tell you, in my own life and in the role that I have, the privilege that I have of serving in church leadership, there are few things as fearful as the thought of a God who cannot be trusted. The way I've seen that play out in my own life at times, but the way I've seen that play out in others as well, that can be crippling. I just don't know if I can trust him. It's a terrifying thought to read about this God and think, he can't. I don't know if he can be trusted. God, part of what he's doing here is he's showing Moses very, very clearly, and through showing Moses, showing you and I as well, I take my words seriously. I take my promises seriously. When I speak, I can be trusted with what I've said. I mean it. I mean it. That's what God is showing Moses here, and that's kindness. That means that Moses doesn't have to continue on in this story. He doesn't have to continue on even in front of Pharaoh with that nagging thought in the back of his mind going, is God actually serious about his word? Well, this is going to show him in a deeply personal way. No, God is very serious about his word. And again, that's a grace. That's actually kindness. Let me just say for a moment that you may be sat here thinking, what's the big deal about circumcision, being this thing that God has commanded for his people at that time. I know for us in our culture today, there are some who would choose that, some that would choose it for religious reasons, others purely for health reasons, and there are many different thoughts on that. If it's okay with you, I'm not going to preach that sermon, okay? But you might be thinking, I don't get what the big deal is. The big deal is that God has said that this is to be the mark of that covenant, God's covenant with Abraham. If you're sat there thinking, I don't get what the big deal is, my question to you would be, well, would you say the same about baptism? Because the covenant that we are under today is not the covenant, God's covenant with Abraham. The covenants throughout Scripture, they build on one another, and the covenant that we are in today is a covenant of grace. It's a covenant through Jesus Christ. It's a new way. But you know what? That covenant still has a mark. And do you know what that mark is? It's baptism. That's the mark of the covenant that we are under today. So these signs of the covenant, they still matter. They still matter. They are these physical ways that the covenant is lived out. Let me ask again, I said it a few minutes ago, have you been baptized? Have you given your life to Jesus Christ? Have you lived out that sign, that marking of the covenant? If not, come speak to me, come speak to anybody serving, your life group leader. We would love to have that conversation with you. Okay, let's continue on. The second reason this is kindness in Moses' life. Number 2, God is at work removing hidden sin that would have hindered Moses in God's call on his life. God is removing hidden sin that would have hindered Moses. Had God not confronted Moses, making it extremely clear that Moses' rebellion would not go unnoticed, had that not happened, Moses would have continued on to Egypt, and he would have confronted Pharaoh, all of the while knowing that there was this undealt thing in his life. And he would have wondered, when is it that God's going to deal with that? It would have knocked his confidence. In fact, I think, remember last week that we were speaking about Moses being a man who in many ways was filled with fear. I think this is a big part of it. I think it's because of this sin that hadn't been dealt with. Moses knows that there is this area of rebellion, and it has really knocked his confidence. And I get that. I can relate to that. That's what sin does. Again, many of you know the story that Natalia and I have walked over the past few years. I can speak to this from experience. No, this feeling of, I'm going to be found out. I'm going to be seen as a fraud. And then having to continue, well, not having, choosing to continue on in leadership. It knocks your confidence. Fear can really grab a hold of you. I think the reason that we see fear so much at play in the life of Moses is significantly in part because of what we see here in chapter 4, verse 24, what we see playing out. But God showing his kindness to Moses in confronting this, God saying to Moses, no more. We have to deal with this. This hidden sin, this rebellion that whatever time earlier Moses had said, well, fine, I'll back off. This finally being dealt with meant that Moses did not have to continue on in this call of God with this in his mind, with the feelings of guilt and shame that he no doubt would have felt. Not condemnation given by God. God does not give us a spirit of condemnation. He doesn't give that to us. But Moses no doubt would have felt guilt and shame associated from this. And there's an enemy that would have loved to maximize that. Would have loved to make that into a huge, huge thing that would have been crippling for Moses. Because God confronts this in Moses, Moses doesn't have to continue on in that way and with that knowledge of that hidden sin. The writer to the Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 12 says, and for many of you this will be a verse that is familiar to you, he says, lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. Laying aside every weight and sin that clings so closely. So here clearly we see there's something about sin that can slow us down in running our race with God. Maybe some of you are disappointed. I thought I came to Grace City Church because we never talked about sin. Yeah, sorry. But we do, because sin slows us down. God takes sin seriously. But there's grace. I'm not going to leave that out. I have no interest in leaving that out. This table over here shows you very clearly we do not leave that out. But we need to take sin seriously because sin slows us down. It hurts us, and it hurts those around us. We need to take this seriously. But the writer to the Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 12, only a few verses later, in fact, 3 verses later, goes on to quote actually from the Old Testament in saying, "Have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord. Do not be weary, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives." There is this link. The writer to the Hebrews is creating this link between casting off sin that slows us down, that hurts us in running the race that God has called us to with him, and sonship. Saying, don't despise it when God is saying, hey, no more. That thing that's slowing you down, we need to deal with that. The writer of the Hebrews is saying, don't despise it when that happens. Don't despise it. This is evidence of your sonship. This is evidence that you are a loved child of God. But we so don't view it that way. Even culturally, even in church settings these days, we don't view it that way. We view these words, discipline, chastisement, these are dirty words. We don't like this. We don't like believing in a God who disciplines. Discipline is very different than punishment. It's a very different intention. Discipline administered well is always administered for the good of the person receiving it. Now, I know even saying that, I know some of you, I know that's pushing on something that is a real struggle. And for some, it's because of things that you've experienced where you've been told, no, this is loving discipline, but you've just struggled to see it. And that could be because what was administered to you actually wasn't, okay? I don't know. But what I do know is that when God disciplines, 2 things. Firstly, he only disciplines those that he loves. And secondly, he does it perfectly. He does it as a perfect father. And the writer to the Hebrews is saying, don't despise it when God's doing that in your life. 3 years ago, when God confronted something in my life that had been hidden for years, for over 20 years, when it was confronted, I had never in my life felt like I was living in the discipline of God as much as I did then. But you know what's amazing? I spoke to my friend Joel on the phone a couple days after I confessed to my wife, and I said, Joel, the discipline that I'm feeling right now and that I know I'm about to journey into feels immense, but I have never felt as sure that I'm a son of God. You hear me on that? There was this amazing grace that came with it. It hurt like crazy, let me tell you. And listen, I'm catching myself there. Let's not even make it about me. Imagine how it felt for my wife and for others. It hurt like crazy. But I had never been so sure of my sonship. It was like words just fail me to try to articulate that to you. Don't despise it. When you're standing in the discipline of a loving Father, your loving Heavenly Father, don't despise it. It's evidence that you're a son of God, or it's evidence that you're a daughter of God. Are you? You can be. You can be this morning. You can give your life to him this morning. Third and finally, in confronting Moses, God was also saving the life of Moses' son. Moses had 2 sons that he sought at this time, as I was saying to you a few minutes ago, one circumcised, the others not, at least clearly one child who was not circumcised. As I said, the thinking was that Moses' wife likely witnessed the circumcision of her first son, was offended by it, was grossed out by it, became an issue in the marriage. We've covered all of this. But we know from Exodus chapter 17 that to be part of God's chosen people at that time and to be a male and to not be circumcised was a serious, serious offense. Genesis chapter 17, where we first learn about circumcision in all of Scripture, but Genesis 17 verse 14 says, any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Wow. Wow. Church, do you see what Moses' son was at risk of? He was at risk of being cut off from the people of God. because he was a covenant breaker himself, as was his father, Moses, in not circumcising his son. Do you see how serious this is? So God's kindness in confronting Moses and saying, stop, no more, I'm going to get your attention here, was not only showing immense grace to Moses, but it was showing grace to his son and grace to Moses' parents in saving the life of his son. Isn't that amazing? This is kindness that is being shown. Salvation, saving power. How does it come to Moses in this story? How does salvation come to Moses in this story? At what point is it where God backs off and we know that Moses is no longer at the point of death? How does it come about? Friends, it comes about through the shedding of blood. This is the gospel. This is the gospel. Moses' health, Moses' life comes through the shedding of blood. Isn't this such a picture of Jesus? Isn't this such a picture of our greater Adam? Isn't this such a picture of our greater Moses? Jesus Christ, the only one who perfectly lived out God's covenant with man. The only one. What does Jesus do on the cross? Jesus enters into Genesis chapter 17, verse 14. Jesus takes on himself the curse that comes with being uncircumcised. Jesus himself, for a time on the cross, is cut off not only from God's people, he's cut off from the Father himself. The only one in all of human history who is the perfect covenant keeper is treated as the ultimate covenant breaker. And what do we know happens on the cross of Jesus Christ? We know that his blood was spilt. And what is accomplished through the spilling of Jesus' blood that we're going to remember as we go to the communion table here in a couple of minutes? What is accomplished? Salvation comes to all those covenant breakers like you and me who've placed their faith in Jesus Christ. Salvation comes to us as well through the shedding of blood. It's not through the shedding of blood through circumcision. It's the shedding of Jesus' blood on the cross for you and for me.